So, um, if I asked you to point out the most advanced, future-proof development model on Earth right now, you'd probably look at Scandinavia, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe some highly engineered tech hub in Singapore.
Oh, definitely. That's the standard assumption.
Right. But the data we are parsing today, it actually suggests you're looking at the wrong continent entirely. Today, we're asking a question that, well, it kind of breaks traditional economics. Why is sub-Saharan Africa a region that's almost universally labeled in global indices as, you know, underdeveloped? Why is it the only place on Earth currently modeling a statistically survivable post-carbon future?
Yeah, it's a massive cognitive dissonance because when you adjust global development metrics for actual planetary survival, I mean, the entire hierarchy of human progress just flips upside down. High-income nations suddenly look incredibly fragile, and sub-Saharan Africa emerges as this anomaly of high-efficiency survival.
Welcome to this deep dive into the source material. We have a really dense, massive stack of analytical data today, detailing 3 decades of Human Development Index metrics for sub-Saharan Africa, from 1990 all the way to 2023. And for you, the listener, whether you're modeling geopolitical risk, working in emerging markets, or you just want to understand the actual mechanics of global progress stripped of the usual PR, this data is pure gold.
It really is. It forces you to rethink the baseline.
Exactly. So we're going to bypass the basic definitions and jump straight into the structural mechanics. And honestly, the most jarring revelation in these sources is this tiny specific percentage, 2.64%.
Right. That 2.64% is really the crux of the entire data set. To understand it, we have to look at the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index, the PHDI.
PHDI, right.
Yeah.
Because the traditional HDI.
Exactly. The traditional HDI, which aggregates life expectancy, education, and gross national income, well, it has a fatal flaw. It essentially rewards nations for burning the house down. It measures the accumulation of wealth and infrastructure, but it completely zeroes out the ecological cost of that accumulation.
Yeah, the traditional HDI doesn't care if you achieved a zero point 0.9 score by stripping every forest and pumping millions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere. It just sees the GDP in the hospitals and says, A+, great job.
Exactly. But the PHDI introduces a structural penalty. It takes that traditional HDI score and discounts it mathematically based on 2 distinct variables. So you have per capita carbon dioxide emissions and per capita material footprint.
And material footprint being what, the actual physical stuff?
Yeah, the metric tons of raw biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, non-metallic minerals, everything extracted to meet a population's final consumption demands. When you apply this planetary pressure penalty, the so-called advanced economies of the global north see their development scores absolutely crater. I mean, the structural cost of their lifestyle is ecologically insolvent.
But, and this is the hook, when you run sub-Saharan Africa through that exact same planetary penalty matrix, their development score only drops by that 2.64%.
It's wild. It's a statistical validation of a completely different macroeconomic baseline. Their loss rate is effectively a rounding error compared to the, double-digit percentage drops we see in highly industrialized Western nations.
And that's the tension we really want to explore today. Is this region lagging behind, or have they accidentally pre-rehearsed the exact low-carbon, highly resilient structural model that Western economies are currently spending trillions of dollars trying to reverse engineer?
Right. It's a fascinating question.
But to figure that out, I think we have to pull the data back to the starting line, the year 1990, because the raw numbers from 3 decades ago describe a region that was structurally trapped.
Deeply trapped. The 1990 baseline HDI for sub-Saharan Africa was just 0.405. For you listening, if you're familiar with index scaling, where 1.0 is the theoretical maximum, 0.405 isn't just low. It indicates systemic, compounding crises across all 3 dimensions of the index.
It's a society under immense stress.
Exactly. You're looking at an era characterized by the fallout of the 1980s sovereign debt crises, the severe austerity of structural adjustment programs mandated by the IMF, and of course, the initial unchecked explosion of the HIV/AIDS pandemic.
It was an absolute demographic nightmare. But the trend line in the sources from that 1990 baseline to 2023, it's staggering. The region's HDI climbs from 0.405 to 0.568.
That's a 40.2% total increase in human development.
Yeah, 40.2%. But what caught my eye isn't just the aggregate growth, it's the actual shape of the curve on the graph. The growth isn't linear at all. If you track the data, it plods along through the 90s, but right around the year 2000, when the index hits 0.435, the slope violently pitches upward. The velocity of development just accelerates. What actually physically changed on the ground at the turn of the millennium to trigger that?
You're isolating the exact inflection point where international public health policy finally aligned with macroeconomic reality. Pre-2000, sub-Saharan Africa was trapped in a mortality-induced economic drain. HIV/AIDS and malaria, they weren't just health crises, they were labor market destroyers. They specifically targeted the prime working age population.
Right.
So the year 2000 marks the inception of a massive coordinated injection of capital into public health infrastructure, most notably the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and shortly after that, PEPFAR.
Okay, so we're talking about the sudden widespread distribution of antiretroviral therapies and insecticide-treated bed nets. But I want to push on the mechanism here for a second. How does a medical intervention immediately spike an economic and educational development index?
Well, it happens through the stabilization of the household economic unit. Consider the mechanics of an agricultural or an informal economy. If the primary earners in a household fall ill with advanced HIV, they don't just stop generating income, they become a net drain on the household's accumulated capital.
Because of the medical costs.
Right. They require constant care, which pulls secondary earners, very often women, completely out of the labor market. And furthermore, it pulls children out of school to either provide care or substitute for the lost agricultural labor.
Wow. So it's a localized economic collapse. The capital generation stops, the savings are liquidated for medicine, and the future human capital, like the kids' education, is basically aborted to handle the immediate crisis.
Precisely. So the introduction of accessible antiretrovirals essentially acted as a massive economic stimulus. By keeping that prime working age population alive and functional, ARVs reversed the drain. Adults returned to the fields and the markets, savings were preserved, and crucially, children were sent back to the classroom.
So that steep curve post-2000 is literally the mathematical visualization of millions of households shifting from terminal crisis management back to capital accumulation.
Yes, and investing in human capital again.
And the data on life expectancy in the sources perfectly mirrors that. In 1990, a child born in sub-Saharan Africa could expect to live to 49.8 years. By 2023, that number had surged to 62.5 years.
It's an incredible leap.
Adding nearly 13 years to the average life expectancy of an entire subcontinent in just over 3 decades. Breaking it down by gender, women went from 51.7 to 64.6 years, and men from 48.1 to 60.4. And I really want to linger on this because we often treat life expectancy as just a biological win.
Yeah.
But from a development economics perspective, what does an extra 12 years of life actually engineer within a society?
It engineers the demographic dividend. Think about it. When average life expectancy hovers around 49, a massive percentage of your population dies before they reach the peak of their professional and economic potential.
Right, before they can really build wealth.
Exactly. Think about the ROI, the return on investment of human life. Society spends resources feeding, clothing, and educating a person for 2 decades. They enter the workforce, start generating value, but then they die at 48. The return on that societal investment is abruptly truncated. All their accumulated institutional knowledge, their specialized skills, their potential mentorship, it just evaporates.
It's a massive capital flight, but biological.
That's a great way to put it. Pushing life expectancy to 62.5 radically alters the dependency ratio. You now have a vastly expanded cohort of highly experienced adults who are generating surplus value. They are living long enough to pay off debts, accumulate land, build more robust informal businesses, and physically assist in raising the 3rd generation. They provide a vital layer of economic insulation, a societal safety cushion that simply did not exist in 1990.
But this brings us to a massive contradiction in these numbers. We have a 40.2% jump in the raw index. We have 12 years of human life injected into the economy. Yet, if you look at the global HDI rankings, sub-Saharan Africa remains stubbornly anchored around the 170 mark out of 203 countries. I have to admit, I have some skepticism here about the validity of a ranking system where a region can fundamentally transform its internal demographic reality and barely move the needle globally.
Well, the stagnation in rank, despite massive absolute progress, it highlights the brutal mechanics of relative global development. The HDI is a comparative index. While sub-Saharan Africa was executing this heroic climb up the steepest, most difficult part of the development curve, securing basic survival, basic literacy, basic caloric intake, the global north wasn't exactly standing still.
Right, the 1990s to the 2020s. We're talking the dawn of the commercial internet, the explosion of globalized financial tech, the smartphone revolution.
Exactly. The goalposts didn't just move, they went exponential. The West was leveraging legacy industrial wealth to build a digital hyper-economy. And you have to remember, the HDI metric scales logarithmically when it comes to income. So, a country pushing its GNI per capita from $50,000 to $65,000 might gain a similar amount of index points as a country struggling to move from $1,500 to $3,000.
Wow. So it's kind of like running the race of your life on a treadmill that just keeps speeding up. Sub-Saharan Africa is running a marathon at a sprint pace, but they're on a track where the richest competitors have access to bullet trains,
That is exactly the dynamic.
which perfectly transitions us into one of the primary engines they are using to try and catch that train.
Yeah.
Education, and specifically the education of women.
The classroom revolution.
Yeah. The sources show that the expected years of schooling for girls nearly doubled. In 1990, a girl in this region could expect 5.35 years of schooling. I mean, she's essentially aging out of the classroom before puberty.
Which is devastating for long-term development.
Right. But by 2023, that expected schooling skyrocketed to 10.06 years. Boys also saw steady growth, moving from 6.48 to 10.65 years. The gender gap in the classroom is aggressively closing. But I do want to push back on this 10-year metric for a second. In development economics, expected years of schooling is just a raw attendance metric, right? Measured bums in seats. Are we actually seeing a leap in STEM literacy, critical thinking, and market-ready skills? Or are we just warehousing kids in underfunded rural classrooms with absent teachers? Because if the infrastructure isn't there, 10 years in a bad school doesn't equal an economic revolution.
Your skepticism is entirely warranted there, and the qualitative gap in education is a massive friction point. You're absolutely right that a year of schooling in a deeply under-resourced district does not yield the same human capital accumulation as a year in a fully funded OECD educational system. The cognitive outcomes, reading comprehension, math proficiency, they often lag significantly behind the attendance data.
So it is just bums in seats, to an extent.
To an extent. However, we cannot dismiss the structural impact of simply keeping a girl in a classroom until she is 16 or 17, regardless of the curriculum's immediate quality.
Because it alters her biological and social timeline.
Precisely. The secondary effects of female school attendance are arguably as powerful as the primary educational effects. A girl who is in a classroom for 10 years is statistically insulated from child marriage. She's removed from the immediate pressure of early, high-risk adolescent pregnancy.
And the sources back that up. The adolescent birth rate, which is births to young women ages 15 to 19, dropped from nearly 140 per 1,000 in 1990 down to 94.2 in 2023.
And that drop is directly correlated to the expansion of expected schooling. Furthermore, keeping girls in school fundamentally alters the fertility rate and the broader demographic transition. Women with secondary education consistently choose to have fewer, healthier children, and they invest more heavily in the human capital of those children.
I see.
So even if the quality of the math instruction is poor, the sociological restructuring achieved by that 10-year baseline is immense.
Okay, I see the value in that structural shift.
Yeah.
But it leads to a data point in these sources that, I'll be honest, I thought was a typo at first glance. We need to talk about the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
The GDI. This is a crucial one.
Right, so this index measures the ratio of female to male HDI values. The closer to 1, the more gender equality. Sub-Saharan Africa's GDI score is a staggering 0.916. On paper, to a casual observer, a 0.916 ratio makes it look like this region has virtually eradicated gender inequality. It looked like a Scandinavian data point.
Yeah, and this is a classic statistical mirage. It requires a deep understanding of how ratios can mask absolute deprivation. The GDI is purely a measure of relative parity, not absolute achievement.
Right.
The reason the ratio is 0.916 is not because women have ascended to a high tier of development alongside men. It is because both men and women are trapped by the exact same structural ceiling. We call this the paradox of shared poverty.
Shared poverty. So it's like, if I have $10 and you have $10, we have perfect 1.0 economic equality. But neither of us can afford to pay rent.
Exactly. You're equal, but you're both struggling. To puncture the GDI illusion, we have to look at the gross national income, the GNI per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity. In 2023, the female GNI in the region is just $3,622. The male GNI is $5,172.
I mean, $5,172 a year is roughly $14 a day. And the women are at $10 a day.
And that is already adjusted for local purchasing power. So yes, the gap between the genders is relatively narrow, hence the 0.916 GDI, but absolutely speaking, both populations are severely economically constrained. Low-level equality is not true progress. The data reveals an incredibly industrious population generating immense labor output, but without the mechanisms to convert that labor into stored wealth.
That labor output is incredible, though. I mean, look at the labor force participation rates in the sources. Women are participating at 64.3% and men at 75.6%. You are looking at an economy where almost two-thirds of all women are actively working.
They're constantly working.
Right. They are in the agricultural sector. They dominate the informal cross-border trade. They're running market stalls. They are working grueling hours. But if 64% of women are working, how is the GNI still hovering at $3,622? Where is the friction? Why aren't they getting rich?
The friction lies in the nature of the labor itself. The vast majority of this participation is in the informal economy or subsistence agriculture. These sectors are characterized by low productivity, zero social protection, and high vulnerability to climate shocks.
So it's hand to mouth.
Basically, a woman might work 12 hours a day processing cassava, but because she lacks access to mechanized milling, formal credit to scale her business, or cold chain logistics to export her product, the value out of her labor remains minuscule. She is generating enough cash flow to survive, but she is entirely locked out of the capital accumulation cycle. She is a micro-entrepreneur by necessity, not by design. She's operating without the leverage of formal economic infrastructure.
It's like running on a hamster wheel made of mud. You're exerting massive kinetic energy, but the friction of the environment prevents any real forward momentum.
That's a perfect analogy.
And that structural friction brings us to what I think is the most punishing metric in this entire outline, the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index, the IHDI.
This is where the narrative of progress faces its harshest reality check.
The sources show that the hard-won baseline HDI of 0.568 absolutely collapses to 0.377 when adjusted for internal inequality. That equates to a 33.6% loss. One-third of all human development progress in sub-Saharan Africa is effectively neutralized by internal disparity.
It's a massive drain.
To visualize this for you, the listener, imagine carrying a bucket of water from a well, but a third of the water leaks out before you get home. Or it's like a country building a state-of-the-art, high-speed fiber optic network to represent their overall HDI growth. The potential capacity is huge, but 90% of the population is legally or economically restricted to using 1990s dial-up modems to access it. The wealth and health are technically in the system, but the transmission of that progress to the end user is throttled by a massive structural bottleneck.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the Gini coefficient and structural inequality in this context. The wealth exists, but the distribution matrix is entirely broken. And if we dissect where that 33.6% loss originates, it is highly concentrated. Inequality in life expectancy only accounts for about a 2% loss.
Wait, only 2%?
Yeah, only 2%. The gaping hole in the system, the big leak in your bucket, is income inequality. That drives a staggering 39.3% loss within its specific dimension.
Wow. So the life expectancy gains, the bed nets, the ARVs, those were relatively democratic. They reached the rural areas, but the money didn't.
Exactly. Public health interventions scale horizontally, but economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa has historically scaled vertically. You have economies heavily reliant on primary commodity exports. Think oil in Nigeria or Angola, copper in Zambia, cobalt in the DRC. This creates enclave economies.
Enclave economies.
Yes, so the capital generated by resource extraction is captured by multinational corporations, localized political elites, and the immediate urban centers serving those industries. It does not cascade down to the 64% of women working in the informal agricultural sector. So you end up with highly modernized, hyper-wealthy pockets in capital cities, completely surrounded by vast rural and peri-urban populations that are entirely disconnected from that macroeconomic growth.
And the sources put a terrifyingly precise number on that disconnected population through the Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI. Because poverty at this level isn't just a lack of capital, right? It's a physical, daily assault on the human body. The MPI data shows that fully 48.1% of the population, nearly half the subcontinent, lives in multidimensional poverty, with an intensity of 52.2%. Walk us through the actual mechanics of the MPI. What does it mean to be multidimensionally poor versus just, income poor?
Well, the MPI moves beyond the arbitrary $2.15 a day poverty line. It measures overlapping simultaneous deprivations at the household level. It evaluates 10 indicators across health, education, and living standards. If a household is deprived in a third or more of these indicators, they are classified as multidimensionally poor.
What are the specific deprivations? Like, what are we looking at on the ground?
It asks structural questions. Does the household have electricity? Do they have access to a safely managed water source within a 30-minute walk? Are they using adequate sanitation or open defecation? Crucially, what kind of cooking fuel are they using? If a household relies on burning solid biomass, so wood, charcoal, or dung inside the home for cooking, they are suffering a severe living standard deprivation.
And that lack of clean cooking fuel, I mean, that isn't just an inconvenience. It triggers a cascade of other developmental failures.
Precisely. Burning biomass indoors creates catastrophic levels of particulate matter. It leads to chronic respiratory diseases, particularly in women and young children who are proximate to the hearth. This impacts child mortality, which impacts life expectancy. It's all connected.
It is. And furthermore, the sheer labor required to forage for that firewood disproportionately falls on young girls. That pulls them out of the classroom, thereby damaging the expected years of schooling metric we talked about earlier. Multidimensional poverty is a web. You cannot solve the education metric without solving the energy grid metric.
That is exactly the kind of interconnected mechanism that gets lost when we just look at high-level index rankings. The friction is incredibly dense. But despite that 48.1% multidimensional poverty rate, the sources point to a massive unlocking of social and political power.
Yes, there's a fascinating counter-narrative here. Right, because there's this deeply entrenched assumption in Western political science that a society must first become economically wealthy and industrialized before it can afford to become socially progressive or politically egalitarian. First you build the factories, then you build the middle class, then you get women's suffrage. But the data here suggests sub-Saharan Africa is building the legal and political scaffolding before the economic building is even fully funded. Let's look at the Gender Inequality Index, the GDI. It ranks 156th globally. On the surface, terrible. But underneath, the maternal mortality ratio dropped from 948 deaths per 100,000 live births in 1990 to 508 in 2023.
A drop from roughly 1% of all births resulting in maternal death down to 0.5%. While 508 is still unacceptably high by global standards, the trajectory represents a massive reduction in the sheer biological peril of being a woman in this region.
It's the physical unlocking of half the population.
Yeah.
And that biological unlocking directly feeds into the most stunning political statistic in this entire deep dive. In the year 2000, women held just 12% of parliamentary seats in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2023, that number surged to 27.3%, a 15.3 percentage point increase.
The velocity of that political integration is remarkable, especially when you control for the economic realities we just discussed.
I really want you, the listener, to sit with that 27.3% figure. There are highly industrialized, deeply wealthy Western democracies right now that struggle to maintain a quarter of their legislative seats for women. How did a region struggling with 48% multidimensional poverty leapfrog the West in female political representation? What was the mechanism?
The mechanism was often born out of profound crisis and subsequent constitutional engineering. We cannot ignore the historical context of the late 90s and early 2000s in this region, which was marked by severe post-colonial conflicts and civil wars. When nations like Rwanda, South Africa, or Uganda emerged from these conflicts and began drafting new constitutions, they didn't rely on the slow, generational cultural drift that the West used to achieve gender parity.
They didn't have time for that.
Exactly. They utilized aggressive structural engineering, specifically the implementation of legally binding gender quotas for parliamentary representation.
So they didn't wait for the culture to organically elect women. They hard-coded women into the legislative framework from day one of the new republics.
Exactly. In post-genocide Rwanda, for example, the population was overwhelmingly female. The constitution mandated a 30% quota for women in all decision-making organs. Today, Rwanda often sits above 60% female representation in its lower house, leading the world. The mechanism here is that political disruption allowed for the bypassing of legacy patriarchal political networks.
Wow. And having 27.3% female representation across the region, that fundamentally changes the legislative agenda. These are the policymakers who are writing the laws on land inheritance, formalizing the informal economy, and directing public health budgets. Which brings us to the ultimate twist in this narrative, the factor that reshapes everything we've discussed about development and brings us all the way back to that 2.64% revelation from the very beginning, the planetary pressure math.
Ah, yes. This is where we deconstruct the Western monopoly on the concept of advanced development.
From 1990 to 2023, per capita CO2 emissions in sub-Saharan Africa actually dropped. They went from 0.89 tons per person down to 0.68 tons. Simultaneously, their material footprint stabilized at a remarkably low 3.83 tons per capita. Over the exact same 30-year window where they increased their human development by 40%, added 12 years to their lifespan, and doubled the education of their girls, they managed to shrink their already microscopic carbon footprint.
We really have to contextualize 0.68 tons of CO2 and a 3.83 ton material footprint against the global north. To achieve their top-tier HDI scores, a typical citizen in a highly developed Western nation might emit 10 to 15 tons of CO2 annually. And they require the extraction of 20 to 30 tons of material biomass, minerals, and fossil fuels.
So the West built its HDI by leveraging an ecological Ponzi scheme. They pulled future planetary stability into the present to build highways, suburban sprawl, and hyper-consumer economies.
That's essentially it. And historically, the UN development metrics rewarded that extraction. But the PHDI forces an accounting. When you apply the planetary pressure adjustment, high-income countries drop drastically in the global rankings. But sub-Saharan Africa, because of that tiny 0.68-ton footprint, only suffers a 2.64% penalty.
Right.
The resulting ranking inversion is jarring. Sub-Saharan Africa's rank rockets from 170th on the traditional HDI up to 131st on the PHDI.
They leapfrogged nearly 40 nations overnight. But, and I have to play devil's advocate here, is this low material footprint intentional visionary green policy, or is it just the default byproduct of that 48% multidimensional poverty we just discussed? If you don't have electricity, of course you aren't emitting carbon. Are we just greenwashing energy poverty?
That is the vital nuance, and it's a very fair question. It is absolutely true that a large portion of this low footprint is a function of limited, heavy industrialization and a reliance on subsistence agriculture rather than mechanized fossil fuel-intensive farming. It is not entirely by green design. Much of it is forced by capital constraints. We cannot romanticize energy poverty.
Right, because lack of cooking fuel is a deprivation, not a green victory.
Exactly. However, the mathematical reality of what they have achieved remains entirely valid. They have statistically proven that it is possible to achieve massive gains in baseline human survival, literacy, and political equity without requiring 15 tons of carbon per capita.
They've established a new, highly efficient baseline. And the mechanism for keeping that footprint low as they continue to grow, it's already visible, isn't it? They're leapfrogging legacy infrastructure.
Exactly. The leapfrog mechanism is the key to their future. Look at telecom. Sub-Saharan Africa largely skipped the massive resource-heavy process of laying copper telephone lines across the continent. They went straight to mobile networks. Look at banking. With platforms like M-Pesa in Kenya, millions of unbanked citizens in the informal economy bypassed traditional brick-and-mortar banking entirely and went directly to decentralized digital mobile money.
So the theory is they can do the exact same thing with the energy grid. They don't have to spend the next 50 years building centralized coal-fired power plants and thousands of miles of high-voltage transmission lines. They can leapfrog directly to decentralized solar microgrids, wind tech, and geothermal.
That is the path to decoupling HDI growth from carbon emissions. They possess a clean slate that the West simply does not have. The US and Europe are spending trillions trying to unbake the cake, trying to dismantle deeply entrenched fossil fuel lobbies, retrofit legacy grids, and transition away from combustion engines. Sub-Saharan Africa has the opportunity to build a modern, high HDI economy natively on a low-carbon architecture.
Wow. But the sources issue a very stark warning about the fragility of this opportunity. If we look at the data from 2019 to 2023, the vulnerability of this hyper-efficient model becomes terrifyingly clear. The region hit an HDI of 0.557 in 2019, and then the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a global economic freeze.
And the HDI flatlined. For roughly 3 years, the progress just stopped.
The demographic safety cushion we talked about earlier wasn't thick enough to absorb a macro shock without bruising the population. In 2022, there was even a micro dip in expected years of education. That tells me that when the informal markets locked down, families immediately had to pull girls out of school to help secure basic caloric survival.
It reveals the development fault line. Sub-Saharan Africa survived the pandemic, showing a slight mathematical recovery to 0.568 in 2023, but it was a structural near miss. It proved that you cannot maintain social and educational gains if 48% of your population is still teetering on the edge of multidimensional poverty. The resilience is brittle.
So how do they reinforce that fault line? Based on the synthesized data in this outline, what is the actual structural playbook for 2030 and beyond? How do they transition from this precarious low-carbon survival mode into high-quality, resilient wealth?
The sources suggest a tripartite strategy. First, they must monetize the education they've achieved. They have successfully kept girls in school for 10 years. Now, they must aggressively dismantle the legal and cultural barriers in the formal labor market. Women need access to formal credit, secure land tenure, and digital property rights so they can transition from informal subsistence trading to value-added enterprise. The education must convert to capital.
Okay. And second, they have to fix the fiber optic network. They have to plug that 33.6% inequality drain.
Absolutely. Growth cannot remain siloed in resource extraction enclaves. This requires aggressive tax reform, the decentralization of infrastructure budgets to rural areas, ensuring that the massive wealth generated by the coming green transition, specifically the extraction of critical minerals like cobalt and lithium located in the region, actually cascades into the local tax base rather than just enriching multinational tech companies.
And finally, they have to weaponize their planetary pressure advantage. They have the mathematical and moral high ground in global climate negotiations. Their 0.68-ton footprint is a massive geopolitical asset. They need to leverage that PHDI efficiency to attract massive, unprecedented global climate finance. The world quite literally cannot afford for 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa to industrialize using 20th century fossil fuel models. The West needs to finance the leapfrog to solar and microgrids not out of charity, but out of basic planetary self-preservation.
Exactly. If they can attract that green capital, they won't just be participating in global development, they will be dictating its future terms.
And that reframing is where we will leave you, the listener, today. We consume so much fragmented data, so many daily headlines that rely on exhausted 20th century narratives of the developing world. It is incredibly easy to glance at a rank of 170 and dismiss an entire subcontinent as hopelessly trapped in the past. But when you look at the actual mechanisms of change, when you understand how they are adding decades to human life, how they are aggressively rewriting the gender balance of political power, and how they are sustaining immense economic velocity without choking the atmosphere, the narrative completely flips.
The data demands a total reevaluation of what constitutes a developed society in the 21st century.
It really does. If a region can survive, adapt, and grow its human capital by 40% while treading so lightly on a rapidly degrading planet, are they really the ones lagging behind? Or is sub-Saharan Africa quietly assembling the exact post-carbon architecture that the rest of the industrialized world is desperately trying to find? Keep questioning the indices, look for the friction in the numbers, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.